I spent 15 years fixing things that were broken, but I never realized the most beautiful thing in my life was a lie designed to destroy me. Have you ever looked at someone you love, someone you've shared a bed with, shared your morning coffee with, shared your deepest secrets with, and realized you don't actually know them at all, like not even a little bit? It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? If you're watching this right now, please tell me in the comments where you're joining me from. I need to feel that connection today. I need to know that in this massive, chaotic world, there are people who still value the truth, because for a long time, I was living in a masterpiece of a facade. My name is Julian. In our town, people knew me as the timekeeper. I'm a master horologist, a fancy word for someone who restores vintage, high-end watches. I spend my days in a workshop that smells like fine oil and old brass hunched over a workbench with a jeweler's loop pressed against my eye. I deal in microns. I deal in the tiny rhythmic heartbeats of machines that are 100 years old. I love my work because it's honest. A gear either fits or it doesn't. A spring either has tension or it snapped. There is no room for gray areas in a Patek Philippe from 1924. And then there was Vivienne, my wife. If I was the quiet, steady hum of a workshop, Vivienne was the grand cathedral. She is a tenured sociology professor at one of the most prestigious universities on the East Coast. When she walks into a room, the air changes. She has this effortless Ivy League elegance pearls that look like they were inherited from a duchess, tailored wool coats, and a voice that sounds like honey poured over gravel. She was the moral authority of our community. She gave lectures on social ethics, wrote papers on the sanctity of human connection, and was the woman every young girl in town looked up to. We were the gold standard couple. The intellectual and the artisan, the professor and the watchmaker. For years, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. I thought our life was a perfectly calibrated instrument. But Vivienne didn't just want a life, she wanted a stage, and she wanted a hunt. You see, Vivienne didn't just have a wandering eye. It was deeper than that. It was an addiction to the conquest, a desperate need to see if she could corrupt the very things she preached about. She wasn't just cheating. She was collecting people like trophies, and she was doing it with a level of calculated cruelty that still makes my blood run cold. It started with the house. We had bought an old Victorian that needed character restoration, as Vivienne called it. That brought Barrett into our lives. Barrett was a contractor, a big burly guy with grease under his fingernails and a laugh that was way too loud for our quiet hallways. He was crude, he was aggressive, and he was the exact opposite of everything Vivienne claimed to admire. He'd leave muddy boot prints on our hardwood floors and whistle at women passing by the fence. I tolerated him because Vivienne said he was the best. What I didn't know was that while I was at my shop obsessing over the hairspring of a chronometer, Vivienne was inviting Barrett into our kitchen. She wasn't just having an affair, she was performing. She would leave my favorite mug on the counter, still warm with tea I'd made her that morning, while she entertained a man who stood for everything I wasn't. She wanted the thrill of the crude invading the sacred. But Barrett wasn't enough for her ego. Vivienne also had a PhD student named Leo. Leo was brilliant, sensitive, and completely worshipful of Vivienne. He was 24 half her age, and he looked at her like she was a goddess. She didn't love him, of course. She loved the power of breaking him. She loved knowing she could derail his entire academic career with a single phone call or keep him dangling on a string with a suggestive comment during a thesis review. She began a dangerous game of home invasion. That's the only way I can describe it. She started bringing these men into our sanctuary. She knew my schedule down to the second. I'm a man of habit after all. She knew I'd be at the workbench from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. She turned our home into a playground for her double life. But here's the thing about Vivienne, she's arrogant. She started getting bored with just being safe. She wanted me to know without actually telling me. She wanted to see how much she could get away with before the boring, simple watchmaker noticed. She started leaving glitches in the system. I'd come home and find a heavy scent of acrid asphalt and cheap musk clinging to the silk rem cue, the drapes in the living room. Neither of us smokes, and I certainly don't work with tar. I'd find a stray cheap plastic button on the rug, the kind you find on a construction vest near the antique sofa I'd spent 6 months restoring. One afternoon, I walked into my own workshop at the back of the house and noticed my precision screwdriver set had been moved. It's a small thing, but to a horologist, it's like someone moving the furniture in your soul. Someone had been in there. Someone clumsy. I remember sitting at my desk that night, the house, deathly quiet, Vivienne upstairs, grading papers. I picked up a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava I had been working on for her. It was a gift I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. It was a masterpiece of mechanical art. As I turned it over under the lamp, I saw a scratch, a deep, ugly gouge on the back of the casing near the lugs. My heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It went cold. That scratch hadn't been made by a tool. It had been made by someone trying to force the watch off a wrist in a hurry. Someone with rough hands. Someone who didn't care about the delicate gold or the history inside. I looked at that scratch for an hour. In my world, a scratch tells a story. It tells you about an impact, a fall, or a struggle. I looked at the stairs leading up to our bedroom. I could hear the faint sound of Vivienne's laptop keys clicking. She was probably emailing Leo or maybe texting Barrett. The woman I had worshipped for 15 years was a stranger. She had turned our marriage into a broken clock, and she was waiting for me to be too stupid to notice the time was drifting. I didn't scream. I didn't go upstairs and demand answers. If there's one thing a watchmaker knows, it's that if you force a jammed gear, you break the whole machine. You have to be patient. You have to disassemble the piece part by part until you find the speck of dust that's causing the failure. I put the Patek Philippe back in its velvet box. My hands were perfectly steady, but inside, something had shifted. The man who lived for restoration was gone. I wasn't going to fix this. I wasn't going to save us. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the dark garden where Barrett had been working on the patio. I felt a strange detached clarity wash over me. Vivienne thought I was part of the furniture. She thought I was a simple mechanism she could wind up and leave on a shelf. She had no idea that I spent my life observing things that the naked eye couldn't even see. I reached out and touched the heavy velvet drapes. I pulled them back just an inch. The smell of that strange, pungent musk hit me again stronger, this time mocking me. It wasn't just a smell, it was a footprint. I stood there in the shadows of my workshop, my eyes fixed on the empty, dark hallway of our home, listening to the rhythmic mocking tick-tick-tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer, realizing for the first time that every second of my life for the last decade had been timed by a woman who was currently laughing at my silence. The rhythmic pulsing of that pendulum felt like a physical weight against my chest, each swing counting down the death of the man I used to be. I stood there in the suffocating dark of my workshop, my hand still resting on the velvet drape, feeling the residue of a life that wasn't mine. That scent, that aggressive, oily musk of Barrett's presence, wasn't just an odor anymore. It was a stain on the very air I breathed. I realized then that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a tactical choice. In my profession, when a mainspring snaps, you don't just shove a new one in and hope for the best. You examine the damage. You look for the microscopic shards of metal that could ruin the entire movement. I let go of the curtain and turned back to my workbench, the moonlight catching the polished brass of a dozen different clocks. I didn't feel like crying. I felt a cold surgical curiosity. I wanted to know how deep the rot went. I wanted to see the blueprint of Vivienne's betrayal, not because I wanted to save us, but because I needed to understand the machine I was about to dismantle. The next morning, the house was filled with the usual gold standard atmosphere, the smell of high-end espresso, the soft rustle of the New York Times, and Vivienne looking radiant in a cream-colored silk blouse, her hair pinned back in that perfect scholarly bun. She leaned over and kissed my cheek, her lips cool and professional. "I'll be late tonight, Julian," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "The department is having a faculty mixer, and then I need to meet with Leo to finalize his dissertation chapter. You know how sensitive he is about his research." I looked at her, really looked at her through the eyes of a man who spent his life spotting flaws in perfect diamonds. I saw the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine, the way her hand lingered just a second too long on her phone. She thought she was the master of social observation, the expert on human behavior, and here I was the simple artisan, seeing right through her skin. "Take your time, Vivienne," I replied, my voice steady. "I have a lot of work to do on that Patek. It's delicate. It requires a lot of hidden adjustments." As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I didn't go to my shop. I went to the guest bedroom. Barrett had been remodeling the ensuite bathroom for 3 weeks. I walked into the space, the smell of sawdust and drywall dust hitting me. I looked at the tools scattered on the floor. Barrett was a slob, a powerful, confident slob who knew he was being paid to do more than just tile a floor. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and pulled a small black case from my pocket. Inside were the adjustments I had mentioned. As a horologist, I work with the smallest components imaginable. I know how to hide things in plain sight. I had spent the previous night in my workshop not fixing watches but modifying them. I had taken 3 vintage timepieces from my personal collection pieces Vivienne knew and loved, and I had gutted them. In their place, I installed high-gain, ultra-miniature microphones and GPS chips the size of a ladybug. I started with the kitchen. There was a beautiful mahogany wall clock I had built for our 5th anniversary. I climbed a step stool, opened the housing, and nestled a tiny transmitter behind the chime rod. Then I went to our bedroom. I placed a modified bedside clock on Vivienne's nightstand. Finally, I went to her study. I placed a small silver travel clock on her desk, tucked behind a stack of Leo's research papers. "Let's see what the gold standard sounds like when the lights go out," I whispered to the empty room. I went back to my workshop and opened my laptop. I had set up a secure encrypted server. I put on my headphones and waited. I spent the day working on a 19th century French mantel clock, my hands moving with their usual precision, while my ears were tuned to the secret frequency of my own home. At 2 p.m., I heard the front door open. It wasn't Vivienne. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of work boots. Barrett. I heard him whistling a low, jaunty tune that grated on my nerves. He walked into the kitchen, the microphone picking up the sound of him opening the fridge, the clink of a beer bottle against the counter. A few minutes later, The back door opened again. Vivienne was home early. "You're early, Professor," Barrett's voice boomed. "I told the dean I had a migraine," Vivienne said. I could hear the smile in her voice, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Julian is at the shop until 6. We have time." What followed was a symphony of betrayal that I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just the physical sounds, it was the conversation. They sat at our kitchen table and they mocked me. "How does he not notice?" Barrett asked. Vivienne laughed. "Julian. He lives in a world of gears and springs, Barrett. He doesn't see people, he sees mechanisms. He's a simple man. He's the perfect background noise for a real life." I gripped my jeweler's loop so hard I thought the glass would shatter. Background noise. That was my role in her masterpiece. But the real shock came later that evening. Barrett left and an hour later the doorbell rang. It was Leo. I listened as Vivienne shifted her persona. With Barrett, she was the bad girl. With Leo, she was the mentor, the untouchable goddess of intellect. "Leo, come in," she said. "I think you're overthinking the section on the fragility of trust." I heard them go into her study. It wasn't long before the academic talk turned into something else. "I don't want to hide anymore." "Vivienne," Leo whispered, "I feel like I'm betraying Julian every time I see him. He's a good man." "Julian is a safe man, Leo," Vivienne replied. "But safety isn't growth. Julian, he's just a watchmaker. He fixes the past. You and I were building the future." She was playing them both. She was using Barrett for the thrill of the crude and using Leo for the ego boost of being worshipped. And she was doing it all while using me as her financial and social anchor. As the days turned into weeks, my digital museum grew. I had hours of recordings, GPS logs of her late-night seminars at cheap motels, and thousands of text messages. I didn't feel the heart-wrenching pain I expected. Instead, I felt a cold, hard sense of purpose. I began to organize the data. I wanted to turn her own weapons, her reputation, her social standing against her. I started small. I used an anonymous email account to send a tip to Barrett, a photo of Leo's car parked outside our house. A few days later, I watched the GPS tracker. She was at Barrett's workshop. I listened to the audio. Barrett was furious. "Who is the kid, Viv? I saw his car at your place." "He's just a student, Barrett." "Don't be ridiculous," Vivienne hissed. She was lying to her lovers about her other lovers. It was a beautiful, chaotic web, and I was the spider sitting in the corner, gently tugging on the silk. I began to feed Leo similar tips. I watched as the tension began to leak into their interactions. Vivienne was getting stressed. She was losing her perfect calibration. One night, I was sitting in my shop long after midnight. Vivienne was sleeping upstairs. I was looking at a digital file I had titled "The Sovereignty of Lies." It contained everything. I realized I couldn't just leave. If I divorced her now, she'd paint me as the unstable, obsessive husband. No, this needed to be a total restoration. I needed to strip the paint, remove the rust, and show everyone the hollow, corroded interior of Vivienne's soul. I picked up a heavy brass gear from an old clock on my bench. I began to scrub it with a wire brush. I felt a strange, dark satisfaction. I wasn't just a watchmaker anymore. I was an architect of consequences. I looked at the calendar on the wall. In 3 weeks, it was our 15th anniversary. The university was hosting a gala in our honor. It was the perfect stage. I reached for my phone and made a call to a private investigator I'd known since childhood. "I have a delicate piece that needs a professional eye," I said. "I need images, Marcus. High-resolution, undeniable images of a woman who thinks she's invisible. Who's the target? I looked at a framed photo of Vivienne and me. I picked up the frame and turned it face down on the wood. "My wife," I said. I hung up the phone and sat in the darkness. I could hear Vivienne's footsteps in the hallway above. I stayed perfectly still, knowing that from this moment on, every tick of the clock was a step closer to the end of her world and the beginning of mine. The darkness of the workshop felt different that night. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of discovery anymore, but the sharp, electric hum of a countdown. I sat there with that brass gear pressed into my palm until the metal grew warm, matching the feverish temperature of my resolve. Upstairs, the floorboards had stopped groaning. Vivienne was likely settled into our bed, her mind perhaps drifting through the schedules of her two lives, unaware that the very foundation of her gold standard world was being systematically unscrewed bolt by bolt. I didn't sleep. A watchmaker knows that when a complex complication is in its final phase of assembly, you don't walk away from the bench. You stay until the balance wheel breathes. The following morning, the sun broke over the horizon with a cold, pale light that seemed to expose every speck of dust in our pristine kitchen. Vivienne was already there, draped in a charcoal-colored cashmere robe, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she scrolled through her tablet. She looked like a portrait of academic grace. "Julian," she murmured without looking up, "don't forget we have the final planning meeting with the gala committee at 5. It's the 15th anniversary, dear. The university president wants everything to be flawless. It's not just a celebration of us. It's a statement of the department's values." Values. The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed along with my black coffee. "I'll be there, Vivienne," I said, my voice as neutral as a dial tone. "I've actually been working on a little something myself, a tribute. A way to show everyone exactly what these 15 years have meant to me." I watched her leave for the campus, her car disappearing down the tree-lined driveway. As soon as she was gone, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Marcus, the investigator. It was a link to a cloud folder. I opened it on my secure monitor. The images were devastatingly clear. There was Vivienne in the back of a parked truck at a construction site, her face illuminated by a passing street lamp. Her expression one of raw, primal hunger I had never seen in our bedroom. There was Barrett, his large, grease-stained hand tangled in her expensive hair. Another set of photos showed her and Leo at a secluded cabin 3 towns over. In one shot, she was laughing as she fed him a grape, her eyes filled with the manipulative warmth of a hunter who had successfully trapped its prey. But the most damning evidence wasn't the photos. It was the audio Marcus had captured using a long-range directional microphone. I hit play on a file titled site_visit_04. "He's a ghost, Barrett." Vivienne's voice crackled through the speakers. "Julian doesn't even exist in my real world. He's just the guy who pays the property taxes and keeps the clocks wound. When we win that department grant next year, I'm going to ease him into a quiet retirement at a facility upstate. He's already getting forgetful. It'll be so easy." I felt a phantom pain in my chest, not of heartbreak, but of a profound, icy clarity. She wasn't just cheating. She was planning to erase me. She was already drafting the syllabus for my disappearance. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of hyper-focused preparation. I wasn't just a watchmaker. I was a film editor, a social engineer, and a ghost in my own home. I attended the gala committee meetings with the stoic patience of a man watching a fuse burn. I also intensified the friction between her lovers. I sent Barrett an anonymous recording of Vivienne telling Leo that Barrett was just a temporary distraction. For Leo, I sent a copy of a fake prenuptial modification I drafted, making it look like Vivienne was planning to funnel her research grants into a joint account with Barrett. The results were immediate. I listened through the hidden mics as their secret meetings turned into battlegrounds of accusation and insecurity. Vivienne was fraying. She was losing her grip on the strings. The night of the gala arrived. The grand ballroom of the Heritage Hotel was a sea of black ties and evening gowns. Vivienne looked breathtaking in a floor-length midnight blue gown, her neck adorned with the Patek Philippe Calatrava necklace I had restored for her, the one now housing a live broadcast transmitter. Barrett was there, hidden in the logistics crew. Leo was there too, his eyes red-rimmed and fixed on Vivienne. I stood by her side, the steady husband accepting congratulations with a practiced nod. The university president took the stage. Tonight, we celebrate 15 years of brilliance. Julian and Vivienne, please come forward. The room erupted in applause. We walked onto the stage bathed in the warm glow of the spotlights. Vivienne took the microphone, delivering a speech about transparency, trust, and the enduring nature of human bonds. And now, the president announced Julian has prepared a special presentation, a journey through their 15 years together, a legacy of time. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to total darkness. I stepped back into the shadows of the stage, my hand reaching for the remote trigger in my pocket. 15 years. My voice echoed through the surround sound system. It's a long time to keep a machine running, but tonight I want to show you the parts you don't see. The massive 40-foot LED screen behind us flickered to life. It didn't start with wedding photos. It started with a high-definition video of Barrett and Vivienne in the guest bathroom, their voices booming, "Julian is a ghost, Barrett. I'm going to ease him into a facility upstate." The gasp from the audience was a single collective intake of breath. The screen cut to a montage of her late-night seminars with Leo and her mocking the dean's senile leadership. Then came the messages, thousands of them scrolling like the credits of a horror movie, and the financial logs of her embezzlement. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a morgue. Suddenly, a commotion broke out. Barrett roared, "You lying bitch!" As he stormed toward the stage. Leo stood up, his face pale. "You said I was the future Vivienne." The two men met at the base of the stage, in a chaotic blur. Vivienne finally turned around to look at me. Her face was unrecognizable. The mask of the elegant professor had cracked. I stepped out from the shadows and gently took the microphone from her trembling hand. The room went silent, save for the distant sound of sirens. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my glass of red wine, framed by the wreckage of her reputation. I stood there and let the silence stretch until it was deafening, the only clock left in the room being the one I had just stopped forever. The red wine was cold against my tongue, a sharp acidic contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom's collective shock. I watched Vivienne's reflection in the massive screen behind us, a ghost of a woman standing amidst the digital debris of her own deceit. The sirens were closer now, their blue and red pulses beginning to lick at the high frosted windows of the Heritage Hotel. Barrett was being pinned to a linen-covered table by 3 security guards, his face beet red, screaming obscenities. Leo had collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, the image of a young man realizing he had traded his soul for a counterfeit goddess. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the profound hollow peace that comes when a clock finally stops ticking. Vivienne finally found her voice, though it was nothing like the honey over gravel tone that had enchanted the university for years. It was a thin, ragged rasp. "Julian, please. This is a misunderstanding. A fabrication." I didn't let her finish. I reached into the breast pocket of my tuxedo and pulled out a single cream-colored envelope. I held it out to her, my hand as steady as a mountain. "It's over, Vivienne," I said. "The gears have seized. There is no more winding this back up." I simply let it drop. It fluttered to the stage floor, landing right on top of a projected image of a text message where she had called me dead weight. That's a signed confession of your departmental embezzlement cross-referenced with your travel logs and the receipts for Barrett's renovations on our home. I continued speaking to the room as much as to her. "And tucked behind it is a petition for divorce. You're leaving with exactly what you brought into this marriage, a cheap suitcase and a talent for fiction." The dean, a man who had once treated Vivienne like a daughter, stepped onto the edge of the stage. His face was a mask of cold academic fury. "Professor, I think it's best if you leave now. Your tenure review is officially terminated." Vivienne looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. She was no longer the gold standard. She was a case study in sociopathic failure. She tried to walk off the stage with some shred of grace, but as she stepped down, her heel caught on the hem of that midnight blue gown. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the marble floor in front of a bank of news cameras. The flashes went off like a firing squad. The professor of ethics was literally crawling through the ruins of her own party. I stayed on the stage. I watched the security detail lead Barrett out in handcuffs. I watched a group of students lead a sobbing Leo toward the exit. And I watched Vivienne disappear through the revolving doors of the hotel, chased by the very media she had spent a decade courting. I drove home in the dark. The Victorian house looked different tonight. It didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a hollowed-out shell, a stage where a bad play had finally closed. I went straight to my workshop in the back. I sat down at my bench and pulled the heavy brass gear I had been scrubbing earlier out of my pocket. It was clean now, but the metal underneath was scarred. I picked up the vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava I had taken back from Vivienne during the chaos. I looked at that deep, ugly gouge on the casing again, the mark left by Barrett's rough hands. It was the only thing left of their conquest. With a pair of precision tweezers, I began to disassemble the watch. One by one, I laid out the tiny screws, the balance wheel, the hairspring, and the escapement. I worked with a level of focus that was almost meditative. I wasn't just taking apart a watch. I was deconstructing the last 15 years. By 4 a.m., the watch was nothing but a collection of parts on a tray. The movement was gone. The heart had stopped. I sat at the table, the same table where Vivienne and Barrett had mocked my simple life. I looked out at the garden. The sun was starting to rise, a pale gold line on the horizon. I realized then that Vivienne was wrong about one thing. She thought I fixed the past. But as a watchmaker, I don't just fix the past. I ensure the future keeps moving. I ensure that time doesn't stand still. I went back to the workshop and picked up the tray of parts. I didn't put them back together. I didn't try to restore the Patek. Instead, I walked over to the heavy metal trash bin in the corner. I tilted the tray and I watched as the tiny gold gears, the sapphire bearings, and the shattered crystal tumbled into the bin with a soft metallic clatter. The gold standard was gone. I walked over to the large grandfather clock in the foyer, the one that had been the heartbeat of this house, the one Vivienne had used to time her lies. I opened the glass door and reached inside. I grabbed the heavy brass pendulum, feeling its cold weight one last time, and I held it still. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a fresh start. I walked out of the house, leaving the door unlocked, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The world was waking up, but for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't running on someone else's schedule. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of pine and possibility, and I started walking toward the town center, toward my shop, toward a life where the only hands that moved were my own.